On your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, March 2nd, 2022, we're talking about Detroit schools and school buildings. I'm Jer Stays. It's undeniable that the fate of the city of Detroit is wrapped up with the fate of its public schools. The latest is that $700 million will be spent by DPSCD on physical public school spaces. That's a lot of money and a lot of ground to cover. So to learn more, my guest is Chalkbeat Detroit's Ethan Bakuli. He's been watching the story and will help get the rest of us on the same page about where things are at. That's after I think our newest member, Dylan, who joined us at patreon.com/dailydetroit. If you want to help us do some big things in 2022, consider joining up. All right, let's just jump into it. Joining me on the line, Chalkbeat reporter Ethan Bakuli. Welcome to Daily Detroit.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Let's get started with a quick rundown on how did we get here with so many buildings' futures in the air and so much in flux.
Yeah, of course. The condition of buildings here across Detroit Public Schools Community District has been a sore spot for a lot of people within the district and in the surrounding community. I think as recently as 2016, there was a teacher strike where, you had educators, faculty really staging protests to demand fixes to buildings. I mean, whether you had chipped ceiling tiles or exposed asbestos, I mean, it was just a bad state for a handful of schools across the district. And we have about 100 or so schools. So a lot of these issues sort of came about while the district was under emergency management and were things that kind of weren't specifically addressed at that time. Flash forward to 2017, we had Superintendent Nikolai Vitti come in, and one of the things that he sort of pushed in his initial arrival to the district was trying to address these issues at a slow and steady pace, but trying to do things that would make sure that these overwhelming building issues didn't last going on. So we had an audit, I would say around 2018, 2019, where the district had looked into just the facility, wear and tear grades for them. There was going to be a discussion around what the district could do with the money that they had at the time back in, late 2019, pre-pandemic. Obviously, once things shut down around March of 2020, things kind of changed. So this is like the first time since those kind of early discussions where we get the opportunity to be able to say, this is kind of what the state of Detroit school buildings looks like. And it's shown that, there's a handful of things. I mean, this is a pretty comprehensive plan, and we'll get into it, but there are buildings being set to be demolished. There are buildings that are being set to be renovated, consolidations, the creation of new buildings or new facility centers. So it's coming about because we're also just seeing like an influx of COVID relief funding for the first time.
To be clear, that COVID relief funding, your article says about $700 million, which is a huge chunk of change. That is something that can really accelerate this because the superintendent's hands have been kind of tied with limited funds, right?
Yeah. I mean, before this, I think there was like a very slim expectation of how much they could actually be able to spend on it. I mean, it was going to be just broken up into chunks. When the audit came out, I think they estimated that they would need by 2023, $1.5 billion in facility needs to be met. That number has kind of increased since then because of just construction costs due to the pandemic, making it even more. So I think the full total needs that the district has said is $2.1 billion to completely invest in facilities. So this $700 million is a good chunk of that, but doesn't come close to that. And the district is receiving I think $1.2 billion from COVID relief funding to address things. So this is the majority of where that money is going. But they've been also trying to put it towards COVID protocols and other things.
I mean, it just sinks in, just the size of the issues that have to be untangled here. I mean, that $700 million, it'll make a dent, but it's not even half of that $2.1 billion number.
I think, for people who have really spoken about the impact of what this money means, I mean, it is probably going to be, once in a lifetime chance to have this much money coming in to actually address things in a significant way. I mean, before the district announced its proposal a few weeks back, I mean, they proposed it as being a 20-year facility plan. And I think the hope and expectation is that this will be able to prioritize school buildings and really give a view for the years to come. I know that part of what the plan really pulled from was, the most recent census data, sort of looking at population trends across Detroit, looking at demands from both school members, facility and faculty, as well as just like what communities have really been looking at. And like you said earlier, I mean, that also looks at like, the longstanding vacant buildings that we can see around the district. I know, we've, especially in covering the school board meetings, Cooley has been one of those schools that's come up from a lot of people. There's a lot of interest from nonprofits around the city and some community members, faith leaders to really see some of those buildings addressed and refurbished for new purposes. And so I think this is something that impacts everybody who lives in Detroit, whether or not you live near close to a vacant school or a school that's been in poor conditions for a while, or just in general.
From a greater perspective, education is cited as one of the top deciding factors about whether or not people stay in Detroit or whether they invest in Detroit. Like, education is the bedrock of all of those conversations. There's going to be some buildings rebuilt, and is that going to be in the more high demand areas? Is that's using that census data?
Yeah, so I think the ones that have been slated to be rebuilt are Cody High School, Pershing, Robinson, Paul Robeson, Thurgood Marshall, Phoenix Academy, which closed down, I think, a couple of years back, and Karsten. So those are all in places where they still see a good influx of students coming in. Those buildings are just not really in a place where they can be just like piecemeal repaired. I mean, I think it just has to be like completely rebuilt from the ground up.
There's a number of buildings as well. You mentioned Northern High School. That one is very near the studio. So that one's near and close to my heart. But so you mentioned Northern High School, but there's a lot more to that that are going to be reactivated. Can you talk about those? And are those also in high demand areas? I mean, to me, it's exciting to see the idea that there are high demand areas in the district, because yes, there have been enrollment declines, but to see that there's areas where students, that's a good sign.
Yeah. And I think that's something that prior to the pandemic, one thing that the school district has said and what we've seen was that there was sort of a steady rise back in enrollment. We had reached the 50,000 mark for students. Obviously, the pandemic has kind of led to a decline. We're kind of hovering around that 46,000, 48,000 student mark. I think most recently it's around 48, 49,000. So I think the signs are there that those places, in particular neighborhoods, are primed to have students be there and for communities to continue to want to live in those kind of areas. So in terms of schools being reactivated, I think one thing that was really pushed by the district is wanting to sort of propose for school buildings to become vacant school buildings to become pre-K centers, really set it up so that when we're looking out towards the future, for areas that are going to have newer families coming in, really setting it up so that they're invested in the full time. So you're getting there from pre-K and making your way up to, high school. So schools I think Chrysler, Fleming, Hancock, like you said, Northern, those would all be envisioned as I don't know if Northern is being envisioned as a pre-K, but those at least previous schools are being envisioned as pre-K centers because of the demand.
And then some additions as well?
Some buildings are just in need of having extra wings that were kind of thrown around prior to the pandemic. So you got J.R. King getting another wing extension, I think, Western, if I'm not mistaken, and Charles Wright. And so that's just providing extra space to those buildings already that have seen steady student enrollment over the years.
There are also some questions about that Aviation Prep High School on the east side. If people don't know, they've got a curriculum focused on aviation careers, whether it's manned or drone flight. Pretty cool. What's the latest?
Students at Davis Aerospace High School, they're going to get the chance to move into either a new wing at our Career Technical Center, or there'll be a new facility sort of at the city airport. But there's still plans being sort of fizzled out with Detroit City Airport right now. That plan would probably not really take place until 2024 to 2025 school year, but it definitely will be a highlight for community members, stakeholders who have been really interested in seeing something being done to really bring up to speed that aviation school. I know it was like a highlight for folks that got involved into it. And I think just over the last couple of years, with a lot of question marks around funding and support for it, this windfall of cash will definitely help boost it.
It's not all about growth or saving schools, unfortunately. There are a number of empty buildings and closures, and they cause a lot of conversation and stress because, well, you can't miss them and they impact a lot of families' lives. Got any more details on that?
There was going to always be something controversial that was going to pop up from this. And I mean, already we've seen that just the language around phasing out school buildings has been something that I think, the district's trying to make it seem a nicer thing. But, obviously for students who are still there and faculty that are there, that's a sore subject. So one thing that the plan includes is just a transferring over of students in different buildings. I think like the plans outline, like a phasing out of Ann Arbor Trail, Thurgood Marshall, like I mentioned before, is, right next to Paul Robeson Malcolm X Academy, one of the district's few Afrocentric schools. So that would be phased out. And so students might wind up being transferred over to different buildings. In terms of just like the scope of it, you can see it wasn't fully broached in the initial meeting. I'm sure it's going to sort of come out as, these community meetings sort of come about. But the district does have these sort of long-term plans of whether or not it wants to sell buildings in areas that they just know they're not going to really have any purpose for, put over a full rebuild into them, or just you see those buildings reactivated. Like I said, I think particularly with some more popular, schools like Cooley High School, they've gotten a lot of attention, and you've had a lot of people flock to really want to see something done, sort of like take away the blight that's really been in the community for such a long time. Aside from the school district, I mean, the city has a handful of those vacant buildings already under its ownership. The district has been for a few months or so, I'm not sure on the timeline of it, but put down a moratorium on the options it can do with school buildings until it came out with this plan. So they didn't really want to chime in to whether or not they were going to sell buildings to any particular bidder, just while they still phase this out. So this putting down the proposal now opens up the ground to just see what's going to happen to those buildings and how they'll be sold over the next couple of years.
Do you get the sense that there's a lot of interest from private groups or public-private partnerships in these old buildings? Like I know one specific case, the old Cooley High and Life Remodeled and all the news about that just got a lot of people talking. Is this something where there would be people interested in buying up these old buildings and working on something?
Tentatively, I mean, just from what I've seen at school board meetings, I mean, there's just been like a primary focus on one particular school building. I'm sure as with this plan out there in the open now, we'll definitely just hear more from it. It just hasn't sort of trickled its way down to what I've seen on the ground across, school meetings and from what's being discussed.
So I understand there's a possibility of an athletic complex. Where is that idea? Is that something that's probably going to happen on the drawing board? Like where is that?
Yeah, so it's been discussed the creation of this athletic complex center. So it would be like a all year round like indoor outdoor facility for students to be able to like play whatever sport, whether it's football, basketball, soccer, track and fields. So I think it's being positioned as an opportunity to really create like a public-private partnership between the district and the city, so that people would be inclined to want to invest in that and use that as a space for whatever team needed to practice or just compete. It did draw some just question marks. I know there was at least one school board member who sort of questioned whether or not we need to invest specifically in athletic complex center or just, build off of an enrichment center that's already available in other parts of the city. So I'm curious to see how that kind of is received by folks. I know, one thing that is kind of been controversial, at least I've seen broadly across the country when it comes to how districts are using the COVID money, is just like, is this going to, a football field? And is that really fruitful to what students need? And we're talking about, mental health, emotional health, academic excellence. But, if there's enough fanfare for that and enough like support from students and faculty, then I think that can be pushed when we get towards the final proposal.
I know that you have a list of the upcoming community meetings up on Chalkbeat Detroit. I will link directly to that. What's your sense? Is this something where the board is really looking for input? Is this something where people show up? You think they're going to make an impact and have their voices heard?
Yeah, I think it's vital. I think what we really didn't get to see in the first initial meetings was the sort of broader community feedback. I mean, that was in part just some technical challenges in the first school board meeting where they announced it. But I think for parents, community members, students, especially staff and faculty, to really be at the table in this moment and just giving their feedback to what the district is planning is important, because this is just impacting, every area of the city at this point. Some areas, some particular schools need more investment versus others. But I think, in terms of what's going to be done for the years to come, I mean, I think people really offering their opinion on it, what they want to see done, is really going to make an impact on what the district really gets to do and propose by the end of the school year, because it's set up to make a decision by June and July, and then from there they'd go into actual construction, which could go on over for the next 3 or 4 years.
Well, this is an important and interesting story to follow. Of course, check all of his work out at detroit.chalkbeat.org. Ethan Bakuli, thank you so much for your time on Daily Detroit. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to your Daily Detroit. Tomorrow, the plan is to talk film incentives. That initiative is firing back up. And Friday, me and Devin O'Reilly will run down the stories of the week and our thoughts on them. Until then, dream of Sunday when it should be over 60 degrees. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.